My daughter-in-law threw a thick folder across our dining table and screamed so loud the windows shook. "This ends today. Either you sign these papers, or you're going to a nursing home." Then my husband, who had been sitting quietly all morning, stood up slowly. He straightened his glasses and looked at our daughter with tears in his eyes. What he did next shocked everyone in that room. "Hello, dear friends. I'm Martha, and I'm so happy you're here with me today on Granny's Voice. I'm 63 years old, and I never thought I'd see the day when someone would try to take away everything my husband and I worked for. Please stay with me until the end of this story, and leave a comment telling me which state you're watching from. I love knowing how far my stories travel." The morning started like any other Tuesday. My husband Robert and I were having breakfast in our small kitchen. Robert is 68, and we've been married for 40 wonderful years. We were eating toast and drinking coffee when our daughter-in-law Jessica walked in without knocking. She had a big folder under her arm and a mean look on her face. Our son Michael was right behind her, looking at the floor like he didn't want to be there. Jessica didn't even say good morning. She just walked to our table, threw down the folder, and started yelling about money and problems and how we were too old to live alone anymore. I looked at the papers she threw down. They were bills, lots and lots of bills. But something felt wrong. The numbers looked too big. There were charges for doctor visits I never went to. There were bills for medicine I never took. My hands started shaking as I tried to read all the words. Jessica kept yelling, "Look at these bills. You two can't even remember your doctor appointments anymore. You're forgetting everything. You need someone to take care of you." Her voice was so mean and cold. Robert just sat there very quiet looking at the papers. He didn't say a word. He just looked and looked like he was thinking very hard about something. "I don't understand," I said softly. My voice was shaking because I was scared. "What are these bills for? I don't remember going to all these doctors." Jessica laughed, but it wasn't a nice laugh. It was the kind of laugh that makes you feel small and silly. "That's exactly the problem, Martha. You don't remember. You're forgetting things all the time now. You can't take care of yourself anymore. You can't take care of Robert. You need help, and Michael and I can't keep paying for everything while you pretend everything is fine." I felt tears coming to my eyes. Was I really forgetting things? Was I really becoming a burden to my family? Robert cleared his throat. It was a soft sound, but somehow everyone stopped talking and looked at him. My husband is not a loud man. He never yells or makes a fuss. But when he speaks, people listen because his words are always kind and true. He stood up slowly from his chair. At 68 he moves carefully, but he stood tall and straight. He looked at Michael, our only son, who still wouldn't look back at his father. Michael just kept staring at his shoes like he used to do when he was a little boy and knew he'd done something wrong. Robert's eyes were sad, so sad it made my heart hurt to see them. "Son," Robert said quietly, but his voice was strong. "Look at me, please." Michael's head came up slowly. Our son is 39 years old now, but in that moment, he looked like the scared little boy who used to come to our room during storms. "Is this really what you want?" Robert asked. His voice was soft but serious. "Is this really who you want to be?" The kitchen got so quiet I could hear the old clock ticking on the wall. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear children playing outside in the neighborhood where we raised Michael, where we taught him to be kind and honest and brave. But right now our son didn't look brave at all. Jessica's face turned red. "Don't you try to make Michael feel guilty," she snapped at Robert. "We've been helping you for months now. We pay for your groceries. We pay your electric bills. We fix things in this old house. We can't keep spending all our money on you too when you won't admit you need real help." I felt my stomach twist. It was true that Michael had been helping us with money since Robert's job cut his retirement money last year. The company he worked at for 35 years went out of business and took most of Robert's pension with it. We had been struggling to pay all our bills. Michael stepped in to help without us even asking. We taught him to help family. But a nursing home. That thought made me feel sick. We're not ready for a nursing home, I said, trying to make my voice sound strong. We can still take care of ourselves. We just need a little help sometimes with money. Jessica spun around to face me. Her blonde hair flew across her shoulders. Take care of yourselves. Really, Martha? Robert can barely walk up the stairs without getting tired. And you've been forgetting things for months now. Last week you couldn't remember our neighbor's name. You forgot where you put your keys 3 times in one day. I tried to remember. Had I really forgotten that much? Maybe I had forgotten some little things. Sometimes I walk into a room and forget why I went there. Sometimes I can't remember a name right away. But doesn't that happen to everyone sometimes? Robert moved then. He walked around the table with slow, careful steps until he stood right in front of Michael. They're almost the same height now. Michael got his father's tall, thin body. But Robert still seemed bigger somehow, with a quiet strength that filled the whole room. Michael, Robert said, and his voice was different now. It carried a heaviness I'd never heard before. Before you and Jessica make any decisions about your mother and me, I need to tell you some things. Things I've been keeping quiet about because I wanted to see what kind of man you've really become. Michael's face went pale like all the blood drained out. Dad, what are you talking about? Robert reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small blue notebook. I'd seen him writing in it sometimes late at night when he thought I was sleeping. When I asked him about it, he just said he was keeping notes about things, nothing important. Now I realized it was much more important than that. This notebook, Robert said, holding it up so everyone could see, has every conversation, every mean thing Jessica has said, every threat she's made for the last 6 months. It has dates and times and details that I think you need to know about, son. Jessica's confident face changed for just a second. I saw fear flash in her eyes before she covered it up with anger. That's crazy, she said, but her voice wasn't as strong now. Robert opened the notebook and started reading. March 22nd. Jessica tells Martha that if she keeps taking her heart medicine, it's wasting money that the family needs. March 29th. Jessica says that Martha's confusion is probably just an act to get attention and sympathy. My blood felt cold. I remembered those conversations. I remembered feeling hurt and confused. But I told myself I was being too sensitive, that Jessica didn't really mean it the way it sounded. I didn't know Robert had heard it all. I didn't know he was writing it down. Dad, Michael said, and his voice sounded strained and confused. What are you saying? What does this mean? Robert closed the notebook and looked at his son with eyes full of love and disappointment. I'm saying that your mother and I have been scared for months, Michael. Scared of Jessica. Scared of losing our home. Scared of what tomorrow will bring. And I'm saying that these bills, he pointed at the papers on the table, are just more lies in a long line of lies. The room exploded with noise. Jessica started shouting, saying how dare Robert call her a liar, saying everything she did was to help the family. Michael was trying to calm Jessica down while also asking his father questions. His voice getting louder and more confused. But I was just staring at Robert. My husband, who I thought had been just quietly accepting everything, had actually been watching and listening and writing everything down. And when I looked into his eyes, I saw something that made my heart beat fast. Robert had a plan. He'd been planning something all along. And whatever it was, I knew nothing would ever be the same after today. I didn't always fear my daughter-in-law. When Michael first brought Jessica home 6 years ago, I was so excited. She was pretty and smart and seemed to really care about our family. She asked nice questions about Michael's childhood. She said my cooking was delicious. She even helped wash the dishes without being asked. She's wonderful, I whispered to Robert that night in bed. She really loves our son. Robert made a small sound, the kind he makes when he's thinking but not ready to say what he's thinking yet. I should have paid more attention to that sound. The changes started small. So small I didn't notice at first. Jessica would make little suggestions about our house. This wallpaper is so old-fashioned, she'd say with a big smile. If you updated things a little, this place could look so much nicer. She started bringing cleaning supplies when she visited, saying she wanted to help, that it was no trouble at all. But her help came with comments. "Oh my, when did anyone last clean under this couch?" Or, "Robert, you really should wipe your feet better before coming inside." Robert would watch these moments with his jaw tight, but he never said anything directly. When I tried to talk to him about it, he'd just nod and say Jessica was trying to help, that we should give her time to settle into our family. Then Jessica started having opinions about everything we did. She thought our weekly dinners with the neighbors were too much activity for people your age. She worried that helping at the church bake sale was too stressful and might hurt our health. One by one, our friends started to drift away as Jessica found reasons why every activity was dangerous or wrong for us. "She just cares about us," I would tell myself, even as I started making excuses to old friends about why we couldn't meet for coffee anymore, why we had to leave church right after the service instead of staying to talk with people. But the medical stuff really started to worry me. Jessica seemed to know a lot about our health for someone who wasn't a doctor. She would point out symptoms I hadn't noticed. She'd suggest that my occasional forgetfulness might be early dementia. She'd worry out loud about Robert's breathing when he climbed stairs. "You really should see a specialist, Martha," she'd say with such concern in her voice. "I've been reading about memory problems in women your age. The early signs are so small you might not even know it's happening." These conversations always made me feel worried and mixed up. Was I forgetting things? Was Robert's breathing getting worse? I started doubting myself all the time, wondering if what I remembered was real, wondering if I was becoming the burden Jessica seemed to think I was. The money pressure started about 9 months ago. Jessica began talking about money every single visit. She'd sit at our kitchen table with her laptop, showing us articles about how expensive healthcare is for old people, how much long-term care costs, how important it is to plan ahead. "I just want to make sure you're prepared," she'd say in a loving voice. "Michael and I love you both so much and we want to help. But we have to be realistic about what we can afford." She started keeping track of everything. Every grocery receipt, every electric bill, every doctor bill. She made spreadsheets showing how much our monthly costs had gone up. Charts showing how our fixed income wasn't keeping up with inflation. "Look at this," she'd say, pointing at her organized data. "Your medicine costs alone went up 40% this year. And these house repairs, Robert, you can't keep putting them off. The water heater is going to break completely if you don't replace it soon." The numbers were overwhelming. I couldn't argue with them. Jessica presented everything so professionally, with such clear expertise, that I felt stupid questioning her conclusions. When she suggested we might need to think about alternative living arrangements, it seemed like the only logical answer to an impossible problem. It didn't feel like the manipulation I now know it was. Robert had tried to resist in his quiet way. "We'll manage," he'd say. "We always have." But Jessica had an answer for everything. "Robert, you're not being realistic. What happens if one of you falls and breaks something? What happens if Martha's memory gets worse? You can't just hope everything works out." She started bringing pamphlets from assisted living places. Expensive brochures with pictures of smiling old people in perfect gardens. "These places aren't like the nursing homes you're thinking of," she'd explain. "They're communities. Look how happy everyone looks." The pamphlets stayed on our coffee table for weeks, a constant reminder that we were supposedly failing, that we hadn't planned well enough for getting old. Robert was the first one to notice that things didn't add up. Little things like doctor appointments Jessica said I'd missed that I was certain were never scheduled. Bills for services I couldn't remember getting. Conversations about my health that Jessica told Michael about but that I couldn't recall having. "Are you sure you told her about the dizzy spells last Thursday?" Robert would ask quietly after Jessica left. I'd search my memory, trying to remember the conversation, but I couldn't find any mention of dizzy spells. In fact, I hadn't had any dizzy spells at all lately. But Jessica's concern had been so genuine, so detailed, that I started doubting my own memory. "Maybe I told her and forgot," I'd say. But Robert would give me that look again, the one that meant he was thinking hard but wasn't ready to share yet. For months ago, Robert started carrying that little blue notebook. He'd write in it after Jessica's visits, late at night when the house was quiet. When I asked about it, he'd say he was keeping track of things, nothing important. But I started to notice he was paying attention differently now. When Jessica spoke, Robert listened with intense focus. He'd ask quiet questions, simple clarifications that seemed innocent but somehow made Jessica defensive. "What was the name of that doctor again?" he'd ask. "The one Martha supposedly saw last month." "Why does that matter?" Jessica would snap. "The important thing is the diagnosis." "Of course," Robert would say calmly. "I just like to keep our records straight." I could see his questions made her uncomfortable, though I couldn't understand why. If everything was true like she said, why wouldn't she want us to have all the details? Why did she seem so reluctant to give Robert the specific information he asked for? "Last month, Robert asked me to start saving all my medical papers. Just put them in this box," he said, giving me an old shoebox from the closet. "Don't tell anyone about it." The request seemed strange, but I did what he asked. Bills, appointment summaries, test results, everything went in the box. It wasn't until I started collecting them that I realized how many of the charges Jessica claimed were mine were for services I never received, appointments I never went to, procedures I couldn't remember having. When I tried to talk to Robert about this, he'd nod thoughtfully but ask me not to say anything to Michael or Jessica yet. "I need to understand what's happening first," he'd say, "before we make any accusations." But sitting here now, watching my husband confront our son with that notebook in his hand, I realized Robert had understood much more than he let on. While I'd been doubting myself, questioning my memory and my perceptions, Robert had been quietly documenting the truth. The bills Jessica threw on the table weren't the first impossible charges she'd presented. They were just the biggest, the most threatening, the final piece of evidence Robert needed to prove what he'd suspected all along. My hands were shaking as I picked up the papers, reading through the charges with new understanding. Emergency room visit for chest pain on a day I'd spent the entire afternoon baking cookies. Specialist visit for memory problems on a date I'd been visiting my sister in another city. Procedure after procedure that I not only hadn't received but couldn't have received given where I'd actually been on those dates. As the truth started to become clear, I felt relief and anger all mixed together. Relief because I wasn't losing my mind. My memory wasn't failing. I wasn't becoming the burden Jessica had convinced me I was becoming. But anger because this woman, this person we'd welcomed into our family, had been systematically destroying my sense of reality for her own purposes. I looked up to find Robert watching me, and I saw in his eyes that he knew I was finally seeing what he'd been seeing for months. My husband, my partner of 40 years, had been protecting me in the only way he could, gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. And that moment was now. Robert opened the notebook again, turning to a page near the beginning. His fingers, rough from years of honest work, traced the lines of careful handwriting. The silence in the room was so heavy it felt hard to breathe. "January 10th, Robert read, his voice steady and clear. "Jessica tells Michael that Martha had a confusion episode at the grocery store, claiming she forgot where the car was parked and wandered around crying for 40 minutes. I felt my stomach drop. I remembered that day perfectly. I'd gone to the store with Jessica, and yes, I'd briefly forgotten where we parked. But it took me maybe 3 minutes to find the car. Jessica had laughed about it at the time, saying it happened to everyone. "That's not what happened," I said, my voice stronger now. Robert nodded. "January 18th. Jessica tells me privately that Martha has been having trouble remembering to take her medicine, suggesting we might need professional supervision. I never missed my medicine," said louder now. "I take it every morning with breakfast, just like I've done for years." Michael was staring at his father with growing confusion and horror on his face. "Dad, what are you saying? That Jessica was lying about Mom's health." Robert flipped forward several pages. February 7th. Jessica shows Michael a bill for $300 from Dr. Chen's office, claiming it was for a memory test that showed early signs of dementia. My breath caught. I'd never seen Dr. Chen for a memory test. I saw him for my regular checkup, and he said my thinking was perfectly normal for my age. Jessica's face had gone white, but she recovered quickly. You're confused, Martha. You're proving my point right now. You can't even remember your own doctor visits. But Robert was ready for this. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. From it he took out several documents. These are copies of all Martha's actual medical records from the past year, which I requested directly from each doctor's office. He laid them out on the table one by one like playing cards in a game. Each one was a small piece of evidence that would destroy the story Jessica had so carefully built. Dr. Chen's notes from February 7th show a routine physical exam with normal cognitive function. There's no mention of dementia concerns, no referral for more testing, and certainly no recommendation for assisted living. Michael leaned forward, looking closely at the medical records. I could see his face changing as he read, confusion turning into something that looked like horror. But the bill, Jessica said, her voice rising with panic. The bill clearly shows charges for cognitive testing. Robert pulled out another paper. This is a statement from Dr. Chen's billing office, confirming that no such charges were ever made to Martha's account. The bill you showed us was fake. The word hung in the air like poison. My daughter-in-law had created false medical bills, invented symptoms, lied about my condition to my own son. The size of this deception was staggering. This is crazy, Jessica said, but her voice wasn't as strong now. Why would I do something like that? What would I gain? Robert turned to another page in his notebook. March 25th. You tell Michael that our monthly expenses have gone up to $2,000 per month, suggesting that assisted living would actually be cheaper. Your expenses have increased. Jessica protested. That's not a lie. No, Robert agreed. But the reasons you gave were lies. He pulled out a stack of receipts and bills from the envelope. These are our actual monthly expenses, which I've been tracking very carefully. Our basic costs are $900 per month, not $2,000. Michael was studying the documents like a man trying to understand how his whole world had been built on lies. But what about all the medical bills, the medicine costs, the home repairs? Robert spread out more papers. The medicine costs you saw included drugs that Martha doesn't take and treatments that never happened. The home repair estimates came from companies quoting prices for work we never asked for. The furnace repair estimate for $4,000 was for replacing a unit in a house 3 times bigger than ours. Jessica was backing away from the table now, her confident mask cracking. You're twisting everything, she said. You're making it sound like I was trying to trick you, but I was just trying to help you plan ahead. By lying about my wife's medical condition. Robert's voice stayed calm, but there was steel underneath now. By creating fake bills. By cutting us off from our friends. By convincing our son that his parents were becoming helpless and needed to be controlled. Michael stood up suddenly, running his hands through his hair. He looked like a man who'd just discovered his entire understanding of reality was wrong. I don't understand. Why would you do this? What did you want? For the first time since this started, Jessica was silent. She stood there, her mouth slightly open, her eyes moving between Robert's evidence and Michael's face, like she was calculating whether there was any way to fix this situation. Robert answered for her. Control, he said simply. She wanted control over our money, our decisions, our lives. And she was using you, Michael, to get it. He turned to another section of the notebook. April 15th. Jessica suggests we should give you power of attorney so you could handle our finances more easily. April 23rd. She brings up the idea of us signing the house over to you so it would be protected if we needed government help paying for nursing home care. Felt sick. These were conversations I remembered, presented as loving suggestions from a daughter-in-law who cared about our security. I'd been grateful for her financial knowledge, impressed by how much she knew about planning for old age. May 5th, Robert continued. Jessica tells you that we've agreed to these arrangements and asks when we can meet with a lawyer to sign the papers. But we never agreed to anything. We never even seriously discussed it, I said, finding my voice again. Michael was staring at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper. Betrayal. Disbelief. The terrible knowledge that the person you trusted most had been systematically lying to you. Jessica, he said, and his voice cracked. Tell me this isn't true. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. For a moment, I thought she might confess, might break down and admit what she'd done. But instead she attacked. You're going to believe him over me, she said, her voice rising to almost a scream. Your own wife. He's clearly manipulating these papers, making everything sound worse than it is, because he can't stand that his precious son might love someone more than his parents. But Robert was ready for this too. He reached into the envelope one last time and pulled out a small recording device. 3 days ago, he said, setting it on the table, you came here while Michael was at work. You thought Martha was napping, but I was listening from the other room. He pressed play. Suddenly the room filled with Jessica's voice, clear and unmistakable. Listen, Robert. I know you think you're protecting Martha, but you're not helping her. She's getting worse, and you're in denial. The best thing for everyone would be if you both moved into assisted living voluntarily. If you fight this, it's just going to be harder on everyone, especially Michael. Robert's voice came through the speaker, tired and strained. Martha is fine, Jessica. Her doctor says she's healthy for her age. Her doctor doesn't see her every day, Jessica's recorded voice replied. I do. I see the confusion, the forgetting, the way she can't keep track of simple things. And honestly, you're not much better. How long do you think you can keep pretending everything is fine? There was a pause, then Robert's voice again. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you stop being stubborn and start thinking about what's best for your family. Michael is exhausting himself trying to support you financially while you live in this fantasy where you're still independent. The house needs work you can't afford. Your medical bills are piling up. Your income isn't enough. You're becoming a burden, Robert, and the longer you deny it, the worse it gets. Robert stopped the recording. The silence that followed felt absolute, as if all the air had been sucked from the room. Michael was staring at the recorder like it was a dangerous animal. You told me they asked for help, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You said they came to us because they realized they couldn't manage anymore. Jessica's composure finally shattered completely. I was protecting you, she screamed. They were never going to admit they needed help. They would have kept struggling until one of them ended up in the hospital or worse. I was trying to solve the problem before it became a crisis. By lying to me. Michael's voice was getting louder. By manipulating me into thinking my parents were falling apart when they're fine. They're not fine, Jessica shot back. Look at them. They're old. They're poor. They're going to need care eventually. I was just trying to plan ahead to protect our future. Robert stood up slowly, his movements controlled. Jessica, he said, and his voice carried absolute moral authority. You have been emotionally abusing my wife for months. You have been lying to my son about our health and finances. You have been manipulating our family for your own benefit. He paused. But most importantly, you have been trying to steal our home and our independence based on lies and fake evidence. Jessica's face twisted with rage. Steal? I wasn't trying to steal anything. I was trying to help. Help yourself, I said, surprising everyone with the strength in my voice. Help yourself to our house, our money, our son's loyalty. Help yourself to control over our lives. I stood up, my legs shaking but my resolve solid. You made me doubt my own mind, Jessica. You made me think I was losing my memory, becoming a burden, falling apart. You cut me off from my friends and convinced my son I was helpless. Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't sad tears anymore. They were tears of rage, of relief, of the terrible joy that comes with finally seeing the truth after months of confusion. But worst of all, I continued, my voice growing stronger, You tried to destroy my relationship with my son. You tried to make him see us as problems to solve instead of people to love." The room fell silent except for my breathing. Michael was staring at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. And maybe he was. Maybe none of us had really seen Jessica clearly until this moment. Robert reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing gently. "The question now," he said, looking directly at Michael, "is what are you going to do about it?" The silence stretched on. Michael stood frozen in our kitchen, his face showing emotions I could barely identify. Betrayal, anger, confusion, something that looked almost like grief. Jessica was first to break the silence, but her voice had changed completely. Gone was the concerned daughter-in-law, the financial expert, the woman who claimed to care about us. What remained was something colder and more dangerous. "You think you're so smart, don't you, Robert?" she said, her tone flat and mean. "You think your little notebook and recordings prove something important. But all you've done is show how paranoid you really are." She turned to Michael, her expression shifting to something that might have looked vulnerable if I hadn't just heard the truth. "Baby, can't you see what's happening? They're trying to turn you against me because they can't stand that you chose me." Robert's grip on my hand tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Michael, look at the evidence. The medical records. The bills. The recording. Don't let her manipulate you again." "Manipulate?" Jessica laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. "I'm not the one secretly recording conversations and building conspiracy theories about family. This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior that proves my point about their mental state." I watched my son's face as she spoke. Even after everything Robert had shown him, even after hearing the recording, part of Michael still wanted to believe his wife. Part of him still wanted to find a way to make this make sense without accepting that the woman he loved had been destroying his family. "The bills are real, Jessica," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dad has the actual medical records." "Which could be fake," she shot back. "Have you considered that someone with declining mental function might not be the most reliable source? That maybe Robert has been confused about which bills belong to what services?" She was doing it again, right in front of us, trying to make us doubt reality. But this time I wouldn't let it happen. "Show him the bank statements," I said to Robert. Robert nodded and reached into his envelope once more. "I thought you might try this," he said to Jessica. "So I also got copies of all our bank statements for the past year." He laid out several pages of financial records. "These show exactly what was actually charged to our accounts, when and by whom. There are no $10,000 medical bills. No $4,000 furnace repairs. No $6,000 roof replacements." Michael leaned forward, studying the statements intensely. I could see him tracing the charges with his finger, comparing them to the fake bills Jessica had shown him over the months. "But I've seen the bills," he said slowly. "You've shown them to me, Jessica. I've seen the invoices, the payment demands. And where are those bills now?" Robert asked quietly. Michael looked around as if expecting them to appear. "At home. Jessica handles all that. She keeps track of your finances so I don't have to worry about the details." "How convenient," Robert said. "And have you ever seen the actual medical records? Have you ever spoken directly to any of Martha's doctors about her supposed memory problems?" The color drained from Michael's face as he realized the answer. "Jessica said it would be easier if she handled all the medical communications. She said it was too stressful for you both to have to explain everything repeatedly." Robert nodded grimly. "Of course she did. Just like she suggested our weekly dinners with neighbors were too stressful. Just like she worried that church activities were too much for our health. Just like she convinced you we needed to be protected from ourselves." Jessica was backing toward the door now, but her retreat only made her more desperate. "This is insane," she said. "You're making it sound like I planned some big conspiracy when all I did was try to help my husband's aging parents plan for their future. By lying about their health." Michael asked, and for the first time, his voice carried real anger. "By facing reality." Jessica snapped. which is more than any of you seem able to do. Robert opened his notebook to a page near the end. June 20th. Jessica tells Michael that Martha had what looked like a small stroke while shopping, becoming confused and needing help to get home. I remember that day, I said, my voice growing stronger. I went shopping alone because Jessica cancelled our usual trip at the last minute. Had no problems. I came home with groceries, put them away, started dinner. But you told me Mom was confused and scared, Michael said to Jessica, his voice hollow. You said she called you from the parking lot crying because she couldn't remember how to drive home. I never called her, I said. I don't even have her number memorized. I would have called you if I was in trouble. Jessica's composure was cracking visibly now. You're all ganging up on me, she said. This whole thing is a setup. You've been planning this attack for weeks. June 28th. Harold continued reading. Jessica brings a brochure from Meadowview Assisted Living and suggests we schedule a tour, claiming Martha expressed interest in learning more. I never expressed any interest, I said firmly. When you showed me that brochure, I specifically said I wasn't ready to consider assisted living. But you told me she was excited about it, Michael said to Jessica. You said she was relieved to finally have a plan. The lies were unraveling faster now. I could see Michael struggling to reconcile his wife's stories with his father's evidence. The confusion was written all over his face. July 3rd, Robert read. Jessica tells you that Martha and I agreed to begin transferring the house deed and establishing power of attorney, that we just needed to schedule a lawyer. We never agreed to anything, I said firmly. We never even discussed it seriously. Michael turned to look at his wife, and I could see the exact moment when belief turned to doubt, when love began to war with evidence. Jessica, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, did you lie to me about all of this? For a long moment she didn't answer. She stood there by the door, her face showing different expressions as she calculated her options. I could almost see her weighing the possibilities, trying to figure out if there was still a way to fix this situation. When she finally spoke, her voice was different again, stripped of pretense and filled with something that sounded almost like relief. You want to know the truth, Michael? Fine. Here's the truth. She stepped back toward the table, her posture straightening as if she'd made some fundamental decision about how this conversation would end. Your parents are living in a house they can't afford on an income that barely covers their basic needs, pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't. They're one medical emergency away from losing everything. One accident away from complete disaster. Her voice was gaining strength as she spoke, as if she'd been holding these words back for months and was finally free to say them. So yes, I exaggerated their symptoms. Yes, I inflated their expenses. Yes, I created urgency about their situation that didn't exist yet. But I did it because someone needed to force all of you to face reality before it was too late. Robert was writing in his notebook again, documenting her confession with the same careful attention he'd shown throughout. You manipulated me, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. You made me believe my parents were falling apart when they weren't. You made me treat them like children when they were capable of making their own decisions. I made you take responsibility. Jessica shot back. Something you never would have done if I just told you the truth about their finances. You would have kept enabling their fantasy of independence until they ended up sick and broke and completely dependent on us. That wasn't your decision to make, I said, standing from my chair. Our lives, our choices, our future. That's ours to decide, not yours. Jessica looked at me with open contempt. Really, Martha? And how's that working out? You're living month to month on Robert's reduced pension, watching your house fall apart, pretending you're not scared about what happens when you can't take care of yourselves. Robert's grip on my hand tightened, but his voice stayed calm. Michael, look at the evidence. The medical records. The bills. The recording. Don't let her manipulate you again. Manipulate? Jessica laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. I'm not the one secretly recording conversations and building conspiracy theories about family. This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior that proves my point about their mental state. I watched my son's face as she spoke. Even after everything Robert had shown him, even after hearing the recording, part of Michael still wanted to believe his wife. Part of him still wanted to find a way to make this make sense without accepting that the woman he loved had been destroying his family. "The bills are real, Jessica," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dad has the actual medical records." "Which could be fake," she shot back. "Have you considered that someone with declining mental function might not be the most reliable source? That maybe Robert has been confused about which bills belong to what services?" She was doing it again, right in front of us, trying to make us doubt reality. But this time I wouldn't let it happen. "Show him the bank statements," I said to Robert. Robert nodded and reached into his envelope once more. "I thought you might try this," he said to Jessica. "So I also got copies of all our bank statements for the past year." He laid out several pages of financial records. "These show exactly what was actually charged to our accounts, when and by whom. There are no $10,000 medical bills. No $4,000 furnace repairs. No $6,000 roof replacements." Michael leaned forward, studying the statements intensely. I could see him tracing the charges with his finger, comparing them to the fake bills Jessica had shown him over the months. "But I've seen the bills," he said slowly. "You've shown them to me, Jessica. I've seen the invoices, the payment demands." "And where are those bills now?" Robert asked quietly. Michael looked around as if expecting them to appear. "At home. Jessica handles all that. She keeps track of your finances so I don't have to worry about the details." "How convenient," Robert said. "And have you ever seen the actual medical records? Have you ever spoken directly to any of Martha's doctors about her supposed memory problems?" The color drained from Michael's face as he realized the answer. "Jessica said it would be easier if she handled all the medical communications. She said it was too stressful for you both to have to explain everything repeatedly." Robert nodded grimly. "Of course she did. Just like she suggested our weekly dinners with neighbors were too stressful. Just like she worried that church activities were too much for our health. Just like she convinced you we needed to be protected from ourselves." Jessica was backing toward the door now, but her retreat only made her more desperate. "This is insane," she said. "You're making it sound like I planned some big conspiracy when all I did was try to help my husband's aging parents plan for their future. By lying about their health?" Michael asked, and for the first time, his voice carried real anger. "By facing reality," Jessica snapped. "Which is more than any of you seem able to do." Robert opened his notebook to a page near the end. June 20th. Jessica tells Michael that Martha had what looked like a small stroke while shopping, becoming confused and needing help to get home. "I remember that day," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I went shopping alone because Jessica canceled our usual trip at the last minute. Had no problems. I came home with groceries, put them away, started dinner. But you told me Mom was confused and scared," Michael said to Jessica, his voice hollow. "You said she called you from the parking lot crying because she couldn't remember how to drive home." "I never called her," I said. "I don't even have her number memorized. I would have called you if I was in trouble." Jessica's composure was cracking visibly now. "You're all ganging up on me," she said. "This whole thing is a setup. You've been planning this attack for weeks." June 28th. Harold continued reading. Jessica brings a brochure from Meadowview Assisted Living and suggests we schedule a tour, claiming Martha expressed interest in learning more. "I never expressed any interest," I said firmly. "When you showed me that brochure, I specifically said I wasn't ready to consider assisted living." "But you told me she was excited about it," Michael said to Jessica. "You said she was relieved to finally have a plan." The lies were unraveling faster now. I could see Michael struggling to reconcile his wife's stories with his father's evidence. The confusion was written all over his face. July 3rd, Robert read. Jessica tells you that Martha and I agreed to begin transferring the house deed and establishing power of attorney, that we just needed to schedule a lawyer. We never agreed to anything, I said firmly. We never even discussed it seriously. Michael turned to look at his wife, and I could see the exact moment when belief turned to doubt, when love began to war with evidence. Jessica, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, did you lie to me about all of this? For a long moment she didn't answer. She stood there by the door, her face showing different expressions as she calculated her options. I could almost see her weighing the possibilities, trying to figure out if there was still a way to fix this situation. When she finally spoke, her voice was different again, stripped of pretense and filled with something that sounded almost like relief. You want to know the truth, Michael? Fine. Here's the truth. She stepped back toward the table, her posture straightening as if she'd made some fundamental decision about how this conversation would end. Your parents are living in a house they can't afford on an income that barely covers their basic needs, pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't. They're one medical emergency away from losing everything. One accident away from complete disaster. Her voice was gaining strength as she spoke, as if she'd been holding these words back for months and was finally free to say them. So yes, I exaggerated their symptoms. Yes, I inflated their expenses. Yes, I created urgency about their situation that didn't exist yet. But I did it because someone needed to force all of you to face reality before it was too late. Robert was writing in his notebook again, documenting her confession with the same careful attention he'd shown throughout. You manipulated me, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. You made me believe my parents were falling apart when they weren't. You made me treat them like children when they were capable of making their own decisions. I made you take responsibility. Jessica shot back. Something you never would have done if I'd just told you the truth about their finances. You would have kept enabling their fantasy of independence until they ended up sick and broke and completely dependent on us. That wasn't your decision to make, I said, standing from my chair. Our lives, our choices, our future. That's ours to decide, not yours. Jessica looked at me with open contempt. Really, Martha? And how's that working out? You're living month to month on Robert's reduced pension, watching your house fall apart, pretending you're not scared about what happens when you can't take care of yourselves. She turned back to Michael. I was trying to solve a problem before it became a crisis. I was trying to protect our future, our financial security, our ability to help them without destroying ourselves. By lying to me, Michael repeated. By making me think my mother had dementia when she didn't. By creating fake bills and emergencies. By doing what needed to be done, Jessica said, because none of you had the courage to do it yourselves. The room fell silent again as we all processed her admission. She hadn't just confessed to lying. She defended it. She wasn't sorry or ashamed. She was angry we'd discovered her deception and frustrated her plan hadn't worked. Robert closed his notebook and looked directly at Jessica. You're right about one thing, he said quietly. Martha and I are facing financial challenges. Our income is limited. Our house needs some repairs. We're certainly not wealthy people. He paused, his gaze steady. But we're not helpless children who need to be controlled and manipulated. We're adults who've been making decisions for ourselves for decades. We have the right to face our challenges with dignity, to make our own choices about our future, and to ask for help when and if we decide we need it. He stood slowly, his tall frame seeming to fill the room. What we don't have is any obligation to give up our independence, our assets, or our freedom to someone who thinks lying and manipulation are acceptable problem-solving methods. Jessica's face hardened. Fine, she said. Have it your way. Keep living in your little fantasy world where everything magically works out. But don't expect us to keep paying for your delusions. She grabbed her purse from the counter and headed for the door. When you end up in the hospital with no money and no plan, don't come crying to us for help. You've made your choice. But before she could reach the door, Harold spoke one more time. Actually, Jessica, he said, his voice calm and measured, there's something else you should know before you leave. Something I haven't shared yet. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, and I could see the tension in her shoulders. Martha and I may not be wealthy, Robert continued, but we're not as helpless as you think. And we certainly don't need to surrender our independence to anyone who would rather lie to our family than respect our choices. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a second envelope, thicker than the first. You see, while you were busy creating crises and manipulating our son, I was busy making some phone calls of my own. The expression on Jessica's face changed from anger to something that looked almost like fear. And in that moment, I realized my husband's plan was far more complete than I'd imagined. Robert opened the second envelope with the same careful movements he'd shown throughout this whole confrontation. Jessica stood frozen by the door, her hand still on the knob, but her attention completely focused on whatever Robert was about to reveal. 4 weeks ago, Robert began, pulling out a thick stack of official-looking documents, I contacted a lawyer. Not to discuss power of attorney or property transfers like you suggested, but to discuss something else entirely. He spread the first document on the table. I could see it had legal letterhead. I wanted to understand exactly what constitutes elder abuse under state law and what legal options are available to people in our situation. Jessica's face went white. Elder abuse? Are you serious? I was trying to help you. Help us by lying about medical conditions, by creating fake bills, by cutting us off from friends, by manipulating our son into believing we were incompetent. Robert's voice stayed calm, but there was an edge now. He pulled out another document. According to the Department of Adult Protective Services, what you've been doing falls into several categories of elder abuse. Psychological abuse through manipulation and threats. Financial exploitation through fraudulent documentation. Neglect through deliberate interference with our medical care and social connections. Michael had been standing like a statue, but now he moved toward the table, his face showing confusion and growing horror. Dad, what exactly are you saying? Robert looked at his son with infinite sadness. I'm saying your wife hasn't just been lying to you, Michael. She's been committing crimes against your mother and me. The word hung in the air like a thundercloud. Crimes. Not just family drama or manipulation, but actual criminal behavior. I felt my legs go weak and had to sit down in my chair. The fake medical bills alone constitute fraud, Robert continued, pulling out more documents. But when you combine that with a systematic campaign to convince you we were mentally incompetent, when you add the attempts to gain control of our property and finances through deception, you're looking at a pattern of criminal elder abuse that could result in serious legal consequences. Jessica finally let go of the doorknob and spun around to face us, her composure completely destroyed. You can't be serious. You're going to involve police over family disagreements. Family disagreements. I found my voice, surprised by how steady it sounded. You made me think I was losing my mind, Jessica. You convinced my son I had dementia when I didn't. You created fake emergencies and financial crises to manipulate us into giving up our independence. Robert nodded and pulled out another set of documents. I also contacted the billing departments of every medical provider and service company whose names appeared on the fake bills you created. They've all confirmed the charges were never made to our accounts and provided sworn statements to that effect. He laid out several official letters on the table. Dr. Chen's office, the emergency room at City Hospital, the physical therapy center on Main Street, the medical equipment company on Oak Avenue. All of them have provided documentation proving the bills you showed Michael were completely fabricated. Michael was reading the statements with the intensity of a man trying to understand how his entire world had been built on lies. But why? He asked, his voice breaking. Why would you do this, Jessica? What did you hope to gain? For the first time since this confrontation began, Jessica seemed to deflate. The anger and defiance drained out, leaving behind something smaller and more desperate. I wanted us to have a future, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you have any idea what it costs to take care of aging parents? Do you know what happens to families when they have to choose between their own security and their parents' care? She moved away from the door and back toward the table, but her movements were different now, less aggressive and more pleading. My own parents went through this with my grandparents. They spent everything on nursing home care, lost their house, ended up in a tiny apartment with nothing left for their own future. Robert was still writing in his notebook, documenting every word of her confession. I wasn't going to let that happen to us, Jessica continued. I wasn't going to watch you bankrupt yourself trying to support them when there were other options available. Better options. Better for whom? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Better for everyone, she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. If they moved into assisted living voluntarily while they were still healthy enough to adjust, they would have been happier. The financial burden would have been manageable. We could have preserved our own future while still making sure they were cared for. Michael set down the legal documents and stared at his wife like he'd never seen her before. So you decided to force the situation by making them think they had no choice? I decided to face reality before it was too late, she said. Someone had to be the adult in this situation. Robert closed his notebook and looked directly at Jessica. The adult thing to do would have been to have an honest conversation about concerns and options. The adult thing to do would have been to respect our independence and our right to make our own decisions. What you did was criminal, Jessica. And the question now is what we're going to do about it. The silence that followed was different from earlier silences. This one felt final, like the moment before a judge announces a verdict. What are you saying? Jessica asked, though I could see in her eyes she already knew. Robert pulled out one final document from the envelope. This is a complaint form for the Department of Adult Protective Services. It documents everything you've done over the past 9 months, supported by the evidence we've gathered. He set it on the table next to all the other papers. Medical records, bank statements, fake bills, legal opinions, sworn statements. The accumulated evidence of months of systematic abuse and manipulation. I haven't filed it yet, Robert said quietly. I wanted to give you the opportunity to understand exactly what you've done and what the consequences could be before I decided how to proceed. Jessica stared at the complaint form like it was a poisonous snake. You would really destroy your son's marriage over this? You destroyed my son's marriage, Robert replied. By lying to him. By manipulating him. By using him as a weapon against his own parents. We're just deciding whether to let you face legal consequences for your actions. Michael had been silent, but now he stepped forward. His face was pale but his expression was determined. What would happen if you filed that complaint? Robert looked at his son with infinite sadness. There would be an investigation. Jessica could face criminal charges for elder abuse, fraud, and financial exploitation. If convicted, she could face significant fines and potentially jail time. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the weight of this. I found myself thinking about how we'd gotten to this point. How a woman I'd welcomed into our family with love had systematically worked to destroy our relationships and steal our independence. There's something else, Robert said, reaching into the envelope one more time. Something I discovered while gathering all this evidence. He pulled out a bank statement, but this one wasn't ours. This is a statement from an account Jessica opened 7 months ago, apparently in preparation for managing our finances once she gained power of attorney. Michael leaned forward to look at the statement, and I saw his face change as he read it. There's money in this account, he said slowly. A lot of money. Robert nodded grimly. Nearly $18,000 transferred from various sources over the past 7 months. Money that was supposedly going to pay for our increased expenses and medical bills. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Jessica been lying about our expenses and medical conditions, she'd been collecting money from Michael based on those lies and storing it in an account we knew nothing about. You were stealing from us, Michael said, his voice hollow with disbelief. You were taking money from me based on fake bills and keeping it for yourself. Jessica's remaining composure cracked completely. It wasn't stealing, she said desperately. It was planning. I was setting money aside for their future care, for when they really would need it. In an account only you controlled, Robert pointed out, without our knowledge or consent. With money you got through fraud, I added, my voice stronger now as the full scope of her betrayal became clear. Michael sat down heavily in one of our kitchen chairs, his head in his hands. How could I have been so blind? He asked, more to himself than anyone else. How could I have believed all of this without questioning any of it? Because you trusted your wife, Robert said gently. Because you believed someone who claimed to love you wouldn't systematically lie to you. Because you're a good man who wants to take care of his family. And she exploited that goodness for her own purposes. Jessica was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration and anger at being caught, at seeing her carefully built plan falling apart. You don't understand, she sobbed. I was trying to protect our future. I was trying to make sure we'd be okay when this situation inevitably became a crisis. But by creating a crisis that didn't exist, I said. By stealing our dignity, our independence, and our relationship with our son. Robert picked up the complaint form and held it in his hands, weighing it like he was weighing our entire future. Jessica, he said finally, you have 30 seconds to convince me why I shouldn't file this complaint today. The challenge hung in the air between them. A final test of whether there was any possibility of redemption, any chance the woman who'd systematically abused and manipulated us might still have enough humanity to do the right thing. Jessica looked around the room, her eyes darting from Robert's face to mine to Michael's, searching for any sign of weakness or sympathy she could exploit. But for the first time in months she found none. She began, then stopped. I can't, she whispered finally. And in that moment, I knew Robert's plan was about to reach its conclusion. 6 months later, I was standing in the garden behind our house, watching Robert plant cucumber seeds in the raised beds he'd built 2 months ago. The late afternoon sun was warm on my face, and I could hear the sound of children playing in the neighborhood where we'd raised our son, where we'd built our life together, and where we would continue to live with dignity and independence for as long as we chose. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After Jessica's confession that day, after Robert laid out all the evidence of her systematic manipulation and abuse, the path forward had been both clear and difficult. Robert had filed the complaint with Adult Protective Services, just as he'd said he would. The investigation that followed confirmed everything we suspected and more. Jessica was charged with multiple counts of elder abuse, fraud, and financial exploitation. She pleaded guilty to reduced charges and received 4 years probation, community service, and an order to repay the money she'd stolen, plus damages. But the legal resolution, while important, had been the easier part. Rebuilding our relationship with Michael, helping him process the betrayal he'd experienced, and learning to trust each other again had been much more challenging. For the first month after the confrontation, Michael had barely spoken to us. He was consumed with guilt and shame about how he'd treated us, angry at himself for believing Jessica's lies, and struggling to understand how he could have been so thoroughly manipulated by someone he loved. I remembered the afternoon he'd finally come to see us, about 7 weeks after Jessica had moved out of their house. He'd sat in our living room, his head in his hands, and cried like the little boy who used to run to us during thunderstorms. I don't know how to apologize for this, he'd said, his voice muffled by his hands. I don't know how to make up for the way I treated you both. Robert had sat beside him on the couch, the same couch where he'd read bedtime stories when Michael was small, and put his arm around his son's shoulders. You don't need to apologize for being manipulated, Robert had said gently. You need to learn from it, and you need to help us rebuild what was damaged. But you don't need to carry guilt for someone else's crimes. It had taken time, patience, and several sessions with a family counselor. But slowly, we'd found our way back to each other. Michael had learned to recognize the signs of manipulation he'd missed before. We'd learned to trust his intentions even when we disagreed with his decisions. And together, we'd built a new relationship based on honesty, respect, and mutual support rather than obligation and guilt. The financial situation that Jessica had fabricated as a crisis had turned out to be manageable with honest communication and realistic planning. Yes, we lived on a fixed income. Yes, our house needed some repairs. Yes, we would eventually face health challenges that might require difficult decisions about our future. But we were facing these realities together as a family, with full knowledge of the facts and respect for each other's independence. Michael helped us create a realistic budget and plan for potential future needs. We made some changes to the house to improve safety and accessibility. We established clear agreements about when and how we would ask for help if we needed it. Most importantly, we'd reclaimed our voices in our own lives. No one was making decisions for us based on fabricated emergencies or exaggerated fears. No one was cutting us off from our friends and community. No one was trying to convince us we were incompetent or burdensome. I'd reconnected with my old friends, including Mrs. Patterson next door, who'd been wondering why we'd become so distant over the past year. I'd resumed my volunteer work at the church, which I'd missed more than I realized. Robert had started a woodworking class at the community center and was making friends with other retirees who shared his interests. We were living our lives again, making our own choices, facing our challenges with dignity and support rather than manipulation and fear. "Martha," Robert called from the garden, interrupting my thoughts. "Could you bring me the trowel from the shed?" I smiled and went to get it, marveling at how such a simple request felt like a gift after months of having every interaction filtered through Jessica's agenda of crisis and control. As I handed Robert the trowel, he straightened up and looked at me with the same steady gaze that had sustained me through 40 years of marriage and the recent months of upheaval. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. I considered the question seriously. The past year had been one of the most difficult and painful periods of our lives together. We'd been betrayed by someone we trusted, manipulated into doubting ourselves and each other, and forced to confront the possibility that our own son might choose his wife's lies over our truth. But we'd also discovered strengths we didn't know we had. Robert's quiet determination to document the truth and protect our family had been remarkable. My own ability to reclaim my voice and stand up for our rights had surprised me. And Michael's willingness to face the truth, no matter how painful, and work to rebuild our relationship had shown us the kind of man we'd really raised. "No regrets about standing up for ourselves," I said finally. "No regrets about refusing to be victims. No regrets about fighting for our right to live with dignity." Robert nodded and turned back to his cucumber seeds, but I could see the satisfaction in his expression. Just then we heard the sound of a car pulling into our driveway. I looked toward the house and saw Michael getting out of his truck, carrying what looked like a toolbox. "What's he doing here?" I asked, though I was smiling. "I may have mentioned that the bathroom sink has been leaking," Robert said with studied innocence. Michael approached us with a slightly tentative manner he still sometimes displayed when he wasn't sure if he was intruding. The divorce had been finalized 4 months ago, and he was slowly learning to rebuild his life without Jessica's constant manipulation and control. "Hey, Mom." "Dad," he said, setting down his toolbox. "I thought I'd take a look at that sink if that's okay." "Of course it's okay," I said, reaching up to hug my son. "But you don't have to fix everything that needs fixing. We can afford to call a plumber if necessary." Michael smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached his eyes. "I know you can, but I want to help. Is that okay?" The difference was subtle but crucial. He wasn't helping because we were incompetent and needed to be managed. He wasn't helping because someone had convinced him we were in crisis. He was helping because he loved us and because helping family members is what people do for each other. "It's more than okay," Robert said, clapping his son on the shoulder. "It's appreciated." As Michael headed toward the house to work on the sink, Robert and I continued tending the garden. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard where Michael had played as a child, where we'd hosted countless family barbecues and birthday parties, where we'd built a life together that no amount of manipulation or abuse could ultimately destroy. "You know," I said, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants, "I used to be afraid that we were becoming a burden, that we were holding Michael back from his own life and happiness." Robert paused in his planting to look at me. "And now I realize that was never really the issue. The issue was whether we would be allowed to age with dignity and make our own choices about our future, or whether someone else would make those choices for us based on their own agenda. I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands, and looked around at our modest but well-maintained home, our thriving garden, our neighborhood full of friends and memories. We may not be wealthy, and we may not live forever. But we're not a burden. We're a family. And families support each other through challenges without lies, manipulation, or force. Robert set down the trowel and took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine just as they had on our wedding day 40 years ago. Jessica was wrong about a lot of things, he said quietly. But she was especially wrong about one thing. She thought that love meant controlling people, protecting them from their own choices, making decisions for them based on what you think is best for them. He paused, looking toward the house where we could hear Michael working on the sink, humming softly as he worked. But real love means respecting people enough to let them live their own lives, make their own mistakes, and ask for help when they're ready. It means being there to support them when they need it, not forcing support on them when they don't. As if summoned by our conversation, Michael appeared at the back door. "All fixed," he called out. "And I noticed the back porch railing is a little loose. Want me to look at that next weekend?" "If you have time and want to," I called back. "But only if it works for your schedule." He grinned and gave us a thumbs up before disappearing back into the house. Robert squeezed my hand gently. "Think he's learned the difference between helping and controlling?" I watched our son through the kitchen window as he cleaned up his tools, moving with the confident ease of a man who was rebuilding his life on a foundation of honesty rather than manipulation. "I think we all have," I said. As the sun set behind our house, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a deep sense of peace that had been missing from my life for far too long. We had faced a serious threat to our independence, our dignity, and our family relationships. We had been lied to, manipulated, and abused by someone we'd trusted and welcomed into our lives. But we had survived. More than survived, we had reclaimed our voices, our choices, and our right to live our lives according to our own values and decisions. The future might still hold challenges. We were, after all, in our 60s and late 60s, and time brings changes whether we're ready for them or not. But whatever came next, we would face it together, with honesty and mutual respect, as partners in life rather than problems to be managed. And that, I thought, as I watched Robert put away the gardening tools and Michael lock up his toolbox, was the way it should be. The way it had always been meant to be. Some people might look at our story and see it as a cautionary tale about the importance of watching out for elder abuse and manipulation. Others might see it as a reminder that family relationships require constant honesty and clear boundaries. But for me, it was something simpler and more fundamental. It was proof that you're never too old to stand up for yourself, never too vulnerable to reclaim your dignity, and never too late to rebuild relationships on a foundation of truth rather than lies. Robert had been right to document everything. Right to gather evidence. Right to confront the truth, no matter how painful it was. But most importantly, he had been right to believe that our family was worth fighting for, that our relationship with our son could survive the damage that had been done to it, and that love based on respect and honesty was stronger than manipulation based on fear and control. As we walked back toward the house together, our hands still intertwined, I felt grateful for many things. Grateful for a husband who had protected our family with patience and wisdom. Grateful for a son who had found the courage to face the truth and work to rebuild what had been damaged. Grateful for friends and community members who had welcomed us back without judgment or questions. But most of all, I felt grateful for the simple, profound gift of being able to live my own life, make my own choices, and face my own future with dignity and tact. That was what Jessica had tried to take from us. And that was what we had refused to give up. And in the end, that had made all the difference. The weeks following Robert's confrontation with Jessica brought many changes to our lives. Some expected and some that surprised us. The legal process moved forward with a kind of inevitable momentum that felt both terrifying and liberating at the same time. Adult Protective Services launched their investigation within days of Robert filing the complaint. A kind social worker named Linda came to our house and spent hours talking with us, looking at Robert's documentation, and making careful notes in her official notebook. She treated us with such respect and dignity that I found myself crying with relief. For months, Jessica had been telling us we were incompetent, that we couldn't be trusted to make our own decisions. But Linda listened to us like our words mattered, like our experiences were valid and true. She validated what we'd been through in a way that helped heal wounds I didn't even know I had. The investigation confirmed everything Robert had documented. Jessica had indeed created fraudulent medical bills. She had indeed manipulated our son with false information about our health and finances. She had indeed attempted to gain control of our assets through deception. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. When the charges were filed, Jessica's lawyer tried to negotiate. They wanted to frame it as a misunderstanding, a family disagreement that had gotten out of hand. But the prosecutor, a sharp woman named Attorney Morrison, wasn't having it. "This is a clear case of elder abuse and financial exploitation," she told us during one of our meetings. "What Mrs. Thompson did to you was calculated, systematic, and illegal. She doesn't get to call it a misunderstanding just because she got caught." In the end, Jessica pleaded guilty to reduced charges. The alternative was a trial that would have dragged everything out for months, and we were ready to move forward with our lives. She received 4 years of probation, 200 hours of community service working with elderly populations, and was ordered to repay every penny she'd stolen, plus additional damages. She was also required to attend counseling for manipulative behavior, and was prohibited from contacting us without permission from the court. Michael was devastated. I think part of him had still hoped there would be some explanation, some way to understand Jessica's actions that would make them less terrible than they were. But there wasn't. She had knowingly and deliberately abused his parents for her own purposes, and no amount of explanation could change that fundamental fact. The divorce proceedings were painful to watch. Michael and Jessica had been married for 6 years, and despite everything she'd done, I knew he'd loved her. Watching that love turn to betrayal and grief was hard for Robert and me. We'd never wanted our son to suffer this kind of pain. But we also knew that staying with someone who could do what Jessica had done would have destroyed him eventually. Better a clean break now than years of continued manipulation and abuse. Michael moved into an apartment across town. He threw himself into his work at the accounting firm where he'd been employed for 10 years. He visited us regularly, sometimes just to sit quietly in our living room, not talking, just being near the people who loved him unconditionally. We never pushed him to talk before he was ready. One evening, about 3 months after everything happened, Michael sat with us in our kitchen, the same kitchen where Robert had confronted Jessica with his notebook of evidence. We were having simple meal of soup and bread, and Michael was quiet, pushing his spoon through his bowl without really eating. "I keep thinking about all the times I should have noticed," he said finally. "All the little things that didn't quite add up. Why didn't I question any of it? Why did I just believe everything she told me without checking for myself?" Robert set down his own spoon and looked at his son with compassion. "Because you trusted her, Michael. Trust is what you're supposed to have in a marriage. You're not supposed to have to fact-check everything your spouse tells you. What Jessica did wasn't your fault. It was her choice, her actions, her crimes. But I treated you both so badly," Michael said, his voice breaking. "I talked to you like you were children. I made decisions about your lives without even asking what you wanted. How can you forgive me for that?" I reached across the table and took my son's hand. "Because we know your heart, sweetheart. We know you were trying to help us, trying to be a good son. Jessica twisted that goodness and used it against all of us. You were a victim of her manipulation just as much as we were." Michael squeezed my hand, tears running down his cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for all of it." "We know," Robert said simply. "And we forgive you. Now you need to forgive yourself." That conversation marked a turning point. After that night, Michael seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the guilt he'd been carrying. He started helping us around the house again, but differently than before. He'd ask if we needed help instead of assuming we did. He'd offer suggestions instead of making demands. He'd listen to our decisions instead of trying to override them. The relationship we built after Jessica was different from the one we'd had before her, but in many ways it was stronger and more honest. Our financial situation, which Jessica had painted as a desperate crisis, turned out to be manageable once we looked at it honestly. Yes, Robert's pension had been reduced when his company went under. Yes, we were living on a fixed income that didn't leave much room for luxuries. Yes, the house needed some repairs and updates. But we weren't on the brink of disaster like Jessica had claimed. Michael helped us create a realistic budget that accounted for our actual income and expenses. We discovered we could cover our basic needs comfortably. We had a small emergency fund that we'd somehow managed to maintain even during the hardest months. We qualified for some assistance programs we hadn't known about before. And with some careful planning, we could afford the modest repairs our house needed without going into debt. We made some smart adjustments. We switched to more affordable cell phone plan. We started buying generic brands at the grocery store instead of name brands. Robert learned to do some basic home repairs himself by watching videos online, saving us money on service calls. I started meal planning more carefully to reduce food waste. None of these changes felt like sacrifices. They felt like taking control of our lives, making active choices instead of being passive victims of circumstances. And there was power in that, real power that Jessica had tried to take away from us. We also made some improvements to the house with Michael's help. We installed grab bars in the bathroom and shower, not because we needed them right now but because they were good safety features for the future. We replaced the old water heater before it failed completely. We had the roof inspected and fixed the few spots that needed attention. We updated some of the wiring that hadn't been touched since the 1980s. These were sensible, reasonable improvements that we made on our own timeline, according to our own priorities, with our own decisions about what was important. No one was forcing us. No one was manipulating us. No one was using our home's needs as leverage to control us. I reconnected with my friends, the relationships that Jessica had systematically worked to destroy. Mrs. Patterson from next door was so happy to see me regularly again. "I was worried about you," she told me over coffee one afternoon. "You and Robert just seemed to disappear. Jessica kept saying you weren't feeling well, that you needed rest and quiet. But something about it didn't sit right with me." I told her the whole story, and she listened with growing anger and dismay. "That woman," she said when I finished. "That terrible woman. I wish I'd pushed harder, insisted on seeing you. Maybe if I'd been more persistent." "Don't blame yourself," I told her. Jessica was very good at what she did. She was believable because she seemed so concerned, so caring. That's what made her manipulation so effective.